Welcome to Game 3 of the World Championship 2021, BN146 here. So the first two games ended in draws. Today was the third game with Nepo once again starting with the white pieces. He started 1e4 in the first game and he did same today. And there was again a lot of speculation as to whether Magnus would repeat the opening he played in the first game, which was the Marshall. He decided to do just that. So they played a very similar opening up until a point as the first game: a6, bishop a4, knight f6. Castles, bishop e7, rook e1, b5, bishop b3, and castles are all the exact same. So now black is again inviting white to go for the Marshall, which would continue here with c3, then d5 with a pawn sacrifice that we looked at, with the pawn on e5 hanging, and then after c6, you get the Marshall. Now again, we mentioned there are many anti-Marshalls. In the first game, Nepo went for h3, which is one of the most popular ones, and in this game, he decided to go for yet another anti-Marshall. This time he decided to play a4. It's another move that delays the idea of playing c3, d4, and he won't play it entirely. He'll go with d3 instead, and he just wants to attack black a little on the queen side, try and create this weakness on b5 and take advantage of it. Magnus calmly replied bishop b7, and as I mentioned, they're all just blitzing here, right? This is all very well within their opening prep. So he continued with d3, Magnus played d6, Nepo continued with knight b d2. These are all the main moves. And here Magnus played something a little less common. So this position has been reached 657 times according to the HS database, and the move Magnus played has only been played 34 times. So the most common move here is knight a5. It has been played more than 400 times, and the idea is very similar to something that you see on the black side of many Ray Lopez's, right? The knight attacks this bishop, the bishop goes to a2, and the knight uses the opportunity to play c5, because what white really wants to do is gain space in the center with an eventual c3, d4. And so black clamps down on that d4 square, saying you're almost never going to play c4 and d4. And then knight is eventually going to come back. Then black is going to try and prepare his own break, which is d5. So white wants to play d4, black wants to play d5. And this is the typical thing. So Magnus decided not to go for the move knight a5. Instead, he played the rare rook e8. And like I mentioned, that's only been played about 34 times. So this was the first kind of deviation into something rare, which is again a theme that we've seen a lot in this match. And in general, that's Magnus's approach to the openings. He doesn't typically play the most theoretical, topical lines, but then he tends to go for something a bit more less topical, a bit rare, in the aim to surprise, but also in the aim just to get a playable position where he can use his natural instinct, because I mean he is the best chess player there is. So he played rook e8. Nepo though was well still in his prep. He didn't miss a beat. He played knight f1. They were still blitzing. Magnus responded with h6, an typical idea to take the g5 square away from both this knight and this bishop. And then Nepo played bishop d2, and this is the critical approach. So we've already mentioned that eventually black wouldn't mind playing this knight e5 c5 idea, and so white decides to take this option away from black permanently, right? So the bishop comes here mainly to patrol the square to make sure black cannot play knight e5. And if black cannot play knight e5, it's a bit difficult for him to achieve the break d5, because that's really what black wants to do. And if black is not able to achieve that, white is almost just a tiny bit better. So Magnus plays bishop f8. Again, he still didn't miss a beat. They both knew exactly what they were doing. And Nepo still blitz out the move knight to e3. Again, clamping down on this square, making sure that black is going to have a lot of difficulty freeing his pieces with d5. And here Magnus played knight e7. So the point is that if you don't allow me to come here, then the knight is rather going to go to e7. First off, it unleashes the bishop that controls both that d5 square, and we are going to play the maneuver c6 and d5. And we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces supporting that d5 square we are going to break through. So that is another common idea that's played in many such positions. And again, they were both not flustered out of the opening. Both were just making moves instantly. And here Nepo revealed this prep, and it's a top move according to the database. This position has been played 12 times, and then 9 of those games continue with this move c4. And the idea is to put a bit more pressure on this pawn here on b5, also to put a bit more, clamp down a bit more on this square d5. But then, of course, there's going to be some exchanges going on here on the queen side, and at the end, white always gets some small nagging pressure. So the main move is to take the pawn, and then the question of how you take the pawn back becomes very interesting. You can take back with the bishop, where this square on f7 starts to look very tender. You can imagine a maneuver like queen b3, which hits this guy, and then hits that square on f7 and you win material. So it's a bit tricky to meet, but presumably Magnus would know. I mean, Nepo didn't do this, would know exactly what to do against this move. But Nepo decided to go for knight takes instead, which is also very interesting. And the knight is heading for a square like a5. And you can imagine a knight on a5, that would be very, very annoying to black's position. The bishop would have to move. You would be able to play c6, and d5 would be all that more difficult to achieve. In addition, it opens up the c file. And so if this pawn doesn't, do something, remains on c7, a rook on c1 could be a problem. However, Magnus again moved instantly. This must have been a bit frustrating, to be honest, for Nepo, because this is move 15, and I mean, you are white as Nepo, so you expect to at least dictate the opening a little. But even after you go down this rare line, this rabbit hole, Magnus still knows exactly what he's doing and plays instantly the very fine move knight e6. And it's not very human, right? Because the knight literally just left c6 for e7. Knight just went to e7, the idea of playing something. And then after c4, he knew exactly what to do. That the knight actually has to just come back to c6. So I mean, it's clear that there's something that he prepared. And the problem is that the knight is kind of shadowing this guy, his counterpart on c4, and so this knight can't really make any forward progress with this knight over here. And if the knight is to go back to e3, then the knight can just go back to e7 with the same plan again. So it's like, you can't make any forward progress. Show me what you have. And so Nepo thought for a few minutes, about 5 minutes, and played rook c1. It's not clear whether he was out of book here. This was the first time that anyone actually thought for any amount of time. But 5 minutes isn't a ton of time. So maybe he was still well in his prep. And rook c1 is also a fine move. The idea is to try and play this tricky move a5 with a pawn. So you clamp down on black's position, and then you play an eventual bishop a4, and you can put a ton of pressure on the c6 square together with his rook on c1. And yet, once again, Magnus knew exactly what he was doing, and he played a5 first. Now you can't play a5, and you have to prove an advantage somehow. And this is the problem with the Spanish in general. These real best type positions, they are so symmetrical, right? That very often the positions tend to be just equal. I mean, there's not a ton of imbalance on the board here. Even the pawn structure is a bit similar. The pieces are quite similar. And so white just has a little bit of an advantage because he moved first, but never really a ton. So it becomes really a battle of who is the better player. But it also kind of increases the margin of skill gap that you need to actually win a game. So at the very top level, usually these games tend to peter out into draws. And unfortunately, unless your opponent just makes a mistake, it's very difficult to get any sort of significant advantage. But Nepo did try something interesting. Played bishop c3. And the point is that he just puts this pawn onto a5. And he's arguing that pawn might actually be weak. So he's just going to put this queen on d2. And the knight can actually take, because he has a knight, a bishop, and a queen that would be attacking that pawn on a5. And you only have 2 defenders. So this was an interesting idea that's actually got Magnus thinking for quite a bit. But again, not too long. It seems he had all this prepared as well. He just needed some time to remember. And he played again, not natural looking bishop c8. And yeah, it looks a bit weird. You're putting the bishop on the starting square. But the point is that the bishop is going to maneuver itself onto this diagonal here on e6. And that exactly happened. And the point is that if you try to go for the direct like queen d2 to try and take that pawn, the bishop is going to come here. And whenever it is that you take the pawn, this bishop on b3 is going to be a problem. So if the knight takes, for instance, the bishop is going to be taken, and then if you take back, your pawn on a4 also hangs, and materialistically you don't gain anything. So after bishop c8, Nepo decided to play d4. I mentioned earlier on that white kind of wants to open up the position with d4. Black wants to do the same with d5. And the fact that this bishop retreated gives white a bit of an opportunity to move forward, because part of the function of this bishop was that I was kind of eyeing this pawn here on e4. So whenever I want to play d4 as black, after an exchange here and the knight's moving away, this bishop becomes an extra piece that's attacking this pawn on e4, and you have the knight and the rook as well, and you can kind of take that pawn. So with playing bishop c8, you kind of release the pressure that you put on this pawn e4, which allows the d4 pawn some space to move forward. So Nepo played d4. The pawn took, the knight took, back knight took, queen took, and then Magnus continued with this plan of bishop e6. And now we see the point once again. The pawn on a5 looks like it's hanging, but again, if you take it, here you can even put in a move like c5, and the queen would have to retreat, and then he would take, and then this guy is hanging. This guy on e4 is actually also hanging. So you can't do this. So here Nepo went into a big think, I think maybe his biggest think of the game. And then he played the move h3. Not entirely sure what the idea was. He thought for about 30 minutes here, so he must have put a lot of thought into this. And I guess in many of the lines he was calculating, either this bishop or this knight or this bishop were getting access to that square on g4. Probably the knight, maybe he saw something with the knight moving here, but yeah, I'm not entirely sure exactly what it was. But of course, h3 it's kind of a waiting move, but it also takes that square away from black's pieces. But then it kind of allowed black to equalize a bit more easily. Here actually he can just go d5. I remember I mentioned d5 is the move that black wants to play to free up all his pieces. This bishop would be unveiled, the file would be open, this rook can come and join the action, and his only weakness left to be the c pawn. But white also has a similar weakness here on b2, and so it would be fairly level. But there's another move that also equalizes. So Magnus played that one. He played c6 instead. And it's a similar idea. He's going to play d5. He's only giving it a bit more protection. And c6 also allows this queen to also help out in defending the pawn on a5, so that it's not actually hanging any longer. I think one of the coolest, I think Anish made this comment that, I mean, if there are two moves that equalize, Magnus tends to play the one that leaves a bit of tension on the board, right? d5 also equalizes, but then there will be wholesale exchanges here on d5, and the position will probably peter out very soon. So 6 is kind of keeps the tension a bit more. The game goes on for a little longer, but as you will see, not too much longer. Nepo continued with bishop c2. This bishop has kind of neutralized his counterpart, so he wanted to go here onto c2, and I mean he knows d5 is coming, so he intends to meet d5 with a push instead, which is one of the ways that you can meet it, so that maybe in some lines you can get this queen and bishop battery with e5 knocking out this knight and maybe attack the king in some lines. So d5 came, and then Nepo as planned met it with e5. And if the knight were to move away, you would see the plan that I'm talking of, where he gets this and then maybe he can get some sort of pressure going on. But of course, Magnus wasn't going to fall for anything like that. After e5, he calculated correctly that he can just take the knight on c4, which he did. Queens came off, and then Nepo took the counterpart on f6. Now, how do you continue here as black? Material is still equal. There's just a slight difference in terms of the piece quality, and you can try and decide what you do here, especially try and identify white's most valuable piece. And it's actually this bishop here on c3. The bishop is doing an amazing job, both defending the only real weakness that white has, and also putting a bit more pressure on black's position, both here and here. So Magnus played bishop b4, and once this bishop comes off the board, the rest of the position is actually quite dry. And yeah, so the pawn took on g7, bishop takes c3, b takes c3, the king took back on g7, and I'm not going to pretend like the rest of this game was any interesting. King f1, things just, I mean, petered out into a draw quite quickly. Rook b1, king f6, the rook took on b8, the rook took back, rook b1, the other set of rooks went off the board. Both sides knew this game was going to draw, so they just needed to make a few moves to get to move 40. I think maybe move 40 is the move after which they can agree to a draw. I'm not entirely sure the rules are. f4, bishop b1, c5, bishop c2, bishop d7, f3, king f6, h4, king e5, king f2, king f6, king e2, king e5, king f2. They agreed to a draw by threefold repetition. So yeah, that is game 3 in the books. Not the most interesting game. I mean, the least interesting that we've had so far, for sure. And I mean, you kind of run the risk of that when you play some of these Spanish lines, because they are all so solid and so good at this level that it might be a bit difficult for you to get any serious edge. But it was also quite a success for Magnus's opening prep. It tells us that at least he's willing to stick to this marshal. He's not just going to mix it up and play any Sicilians anytime soon. So unfortunately, we may not be seeing another Sicilian unless the match situation changes, of course. And yeah, it seems his opening prep is quite solid, because even in these obscure lines, he knew exactly what he was doing, and he didn't really have any serious difficulties in equalizing. So yeah, the onus is on Nepo now to decide what he intends to do with his next white game. I don't know the breadth of the opening prep that he has, whether he will switch up, play another anti-marshal, or go for d4, or go for something else. We live to see. But yeah, it promises to be very interesting. Tomorrow is a rest day. The players are going to relax a bit, so we'll come your way with the next recap on Tuesday with game 4, with Magnus once again taking on the white pieces. Thank you very much for tuning in. Let me know what your predictions are for game 4 in terms of the opening. Will Magnus play 1d4 again? Will he go for that Catalan type setup that he played in yesterday's game? and what do you think the result will be? See you later. Thank you very much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you haven't, leave a comment, drop a like. Happy chessing, and I'll see you later.